Welcome everybody to Tabletop RPG, the Twitter Spaces-based podcast where we talk about all things tabletop gaming from Andrew's Macmillan Universal. Joining us this week is Andrew Kolb. Andrew, thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Andrew is the illustrator, writer, creator, designer, and brilliant being behind Oz, a 5e compatible adventure that's coming out this week. It came out this Tuesday. So we're super excited to have you and super excited for people to be getting Oz in their hands soon.
Yeah, thanks. I've started to see a few people who either pre-ordered or picked it up and are already like tweeting and responding to it, which the reception has been lovely, which I was nervous for, but I'm really happy to see and receive.
Really, really cool to see the reception. It was by far, I think, probably the most popular thing at Gen Con. It sold out, I think, like the first day.
Cool.
Because anybody who picked it up couldn't put it back down.
Oh.
So I really think it was the hot ticket item.
Cool, that's great to hear.
Yeah, absolutely. So we kind of like to split these interviews into kind of two parts.
Okay.
The first, I would love to get to know you a little bit better and a little bit of your history, kind of with gaming and in the space. And then I would really love to talk about how that influenced Oz and how it influences your creative process. So first of all, paging through Oz, I've got my copy in front of me too. I'm glad we both do. Looking through just the initial pages and some of the first things that you encounter as you open the book, the maps are really something that you get struck with. They're so detailed, and they're really, really laid out and really, really similar to like subway maps or to these that convey really complex information you would find in a lot of urban settings. And so I wondered, from your own background, when did you start doing map making?
Oh yeah, great question. I think I really only kind of started getting the maps. Well, I mean, like I guess I would do kind of illustrative maps without any sort of like need for information as an illustrator. Like I guess so. My back more. I went to school for graphic design, then kind of transitioned into illustration, and have kind of married both of those kind of focuses into kind of like game design. So I used to illustrate more kind of maps without information, kind of like in just like, I don't know, as an artist or as an exercise. But map making for gaming really kind of only came in as I started to kind of like run adventures. So now that it's like something that is not just for my group at the table, it's kind of like designing maps for usability and kind of like a bunch of different contexts. That's where I really kind of try to pull from my design history of like, okay, what is the information that's necessary? How do we get that? And kind of introduce a good hierarchy so that way you can hopefully find what you need to find quickly, or at least have an idea of where you would find it if you don't know exactly what it is that you need. Like, oh, I need to figure out the name of this neighborhood, so I know all the neighborhood names are over here type thing. So yeah, that's a bit of my background on map making. And I guess a bit of the approach too. Like I've always loved subway maps, so that's where, I mean, you can see my kind of affection for that in the book as well. I don't know, does any of that answer any of it? I can ramble, so does that cover any of it?
No, we absolutely get around. Great. So that covered it excellently. It's interesting that you mentioned specifically layouts that convey information, and I'm imagining a table that you ran that would be pretty fantastic. When you approach this book from the standpoint of layout, because there is so much information in the book, whether it's setting descriptions, whether it's characters, whether it's items, to maps and to stat tables, just like the sheer amount of things that are in this book is pretty overwhelming. So I wonder in particular, do you have background, obviously from design school, but when you first approached the book, was it from a layout standpoint? Did you think I'm going to start with maps and I'm going to move into characters, or I'm going to move into settings, or was it much more of a process of writing first and then going, if that makes sense?
Oh yeah, no, it's I think because it's kind of like a complete package deal. I think the luck of it is I really kind of can work on everything at the same time. Like I mean, with Neverland was different because I had kind of like been running some of it first, and then had like translated it into something that was kind of digestible for other people. With Oz, kind of having Neverland as a template, it was a case of, okay, I know. Like I mean, the whole thing was driven by I don't know how to run an urban adventure, or I understand, or I'm confident in running a game in the jungle or on the beach, or like in a wild and untamed environment. So what do I need and why do I need it? So it was kind of like research and play testing and kind of like making notes, and then in playing realizing, oh, I will need a lot more names than I do in a wild setting. So I think that would be useful on the page. It was kind of pulling from practical experience, and then from a design standpoint saying, okay, when I'm looking at a spread, what are the things I need most commonly, and how do I make those the clearest, and then what do I need kind of secondary, and kind of just like organizing it that way. So I mean, I will say, as much time as I spend on the drawings and on the tables, I think what I end up spending the most time on is the kind of like random encounter tables, and just figuring out, okay, what is the right balance to make this feel alive? Like, what's the balance between creatures versus NPCs versus kind of like environmental stuff? That is what takes the most time, but is also kind of directed by, I mean, what do I need for it to feel natural at the table? And then that's it. I make it sound like it's a very easy breezy experience that takes like months. But once I get it, then I really stick to it, and like then it kind of builds off of that skeleton.
I think it's really interesting that you built it from the beginning as a table experience. Is something that was built out of things that would come up practically, in interactions between game runners and players. Would you say that the test playing Oz drove design aspects of it? Would you say that it was the experiences that you had around the table, even going back to Neverland, that really informed how you ended up deciding what made it into the book?
Yeah. I mean, like, I would say, as far as the neighborhood spreads, yes. I mean, like, character design and or like stat blocks and kind of like the world. No, I was pretty confident in, because I was pulling from the like source materials. I'm like, okay, this is the world. I'm not gonna, like, if people are having maybe or resisting components of that, that's on me as a GM. But maybe I don't redesign, I don't know, the rules of Oz. But as far as the layout of like the neighborhood, the random encounter tables, that is like I've designed it based on my theory, but and what I think I will need. But at the table, sometimes I will be flipping through or finding, oh, I need this information more than I thought I would, or people are asking more questions about this than I thought. So I need to put that into a different spot or make it more readily available. So yeah, as far as the setting pages are concerned, then yeah, absolutely driven by kind of what my players were asking of me, because I wanted to have that ready for them.
I really like that approach, both as a combination of having such original material and really sourcing what players are interested in and where those experiences kind of come up naturally. I wonder if we could talk a little bit about going a little bit further back to some of your early experiences in gaming, or to when you first experienced role-playing games as a whole. When did you begin playing? Either did you start with D&D?
Yeah, I'm actually, like, I consider myself a real newcomer to the hobby, and that it
It
was.
doesn't show.
Oh, thanks. It was with like a friend of mine, his cousin, winning a game, and because my friend knew I played video games, he's like, "I think you do this." So we ran the Lost Mines of Phandelver, and well, I mean, like, I played in it. Like, the cousin ran the Lost Mines, and I played in it, and I still remember that first night because it really was like, "Oh, this is something that I like really wanted, but didn't realize it was missed till I was." Sitting there in that first, I don't want to spoil it too much, but like that first cart with the dead horse, I'm just like, oh, this is it. Like, it's imagination, it's improvisation, it's crunchy numbers, it's everything that I wanted out of a game in one spot. So that's kind of been my start, and then really quickly transitioned into running games, because that group ran for a long time, but as it dissolved, found that like there weren't many other folks who I knew who would play unless I ran it. So I really became the shepherd that like brought new people to the hobby. And that's where, I mean, admittedly, that's where Neverland came from, was running adventures and like kind of like picking them apart and going, oh, what do I need, and why is this one harder to run versus this one, and just kind of like being curious about that, especially from a design standpoint. And then and kind of getting into Neverland, then going, oh, like, this is what I would do, or this is, I mean, like, if I'm going to make this, I'm going to make it in a way that is easier for me to run, and that's how we ended up with kind of the design of both Neverland and Oz.
What do you think of being at the table yourself? Do you prefer to run games, or do you prefer to be a participant?
Oh, I like both for different reasons. Like, I think I like
Definitely.
I like, I mean, especially with these two, like with Neverland and Oz, I really like like being there when other people kind of like discover it, and like kind of like running it in like ways that maybe not that it wasn't designed, but kind of like really kind of getting into the details that I can't include in the book, because I don't want it to get too granular when I'm writing. So I try to keep things pretty open. So when I'm running it, then I can.
Oh yeah, sorry, we had your mic drop out for just a second. No worries.
Okay.
Yeah, sorry, we were talking about being on which side of the table we prefer, and deciding was the
Okay,
optimal
well,
answer, I think.
how far into my conversation did I?
You just barely dropped off. No worries at all.
Okay. Well, I think what ends up happening is I just want to make sure it doesn't happen again.
Mhm.
Just a second. Can you still hear
No
me?
worries. Yeah.
Okay,
Absolutely.
great. I love being a DM because I love making an adventure or making a setting and then seeing my players kind of poke around in that setting. Um,
Mhm.
so that one's fun, or that from that perspective, it's fun, especially because I can get into the kind of granular stuff that I can't get in the book, simply because I don't want the book to be 1,000 pages talking about every like single detail. So the nice thing about this is I can get into that really kind of like really detailed adventure stuff when I'm running. And then as a player, I just like seeing other people's adventures. Like I like seeing or kind of like exploring worlds that other people have kind of crafted, and I don't know, just
Mhm.
like kind of like learning from others too. Like being able to see, oh, I never thought about running combat this way, or like just kind of like learning from, or just being curious about what others bring to the hobby. So yeah, I love both as a DM and as a player. I'm happy in either seat.
I have to ask, as far as your style as a game runner goes, just because of the amount of content that's in Oz and in Neverland too, and it's something that I'm usually plagued by, which is as I'm getting ready for session, if I'm game running, I'm always convinced that somebody's going to ask like some really obscure NPC, or they're going to ask like what the lore is behind something that's some very overlooked object, and so I go out of my way to kind of try and be prepared for situations like that, and I end up using like 90% of what I have written down because nobody's like going down the side alley to
Right.
talk to the parrot that I specifically wrote just in case anybody like stuck their nose down there. How do you ever deal with that on your own, deciding what is going to make it into a session, or feeling like there's a need to be over prepared almost, or do you find that if you have like other people have told me that they do this, and I don't understand for the life of me how they do it. They're like, yeah, I write notes and then I just improvise based off of them.
Well, I mean, that's what I do. I mean, like, I mean, like, because I've written the books, I have like a pretty good sense of the world, and I'm pretty confident that if they meet a random person, I'm going to be able to engage with them. So I'm very comfortable. Like if they meet an NPC and they ask a question, um, I also think it's okay if one, if the NPC doesn't have the information, or two, if the NPC is like, well, I don't know, but I will like find out, or like if you pay me 10 GP, then I like find out for you, and then that becomes kind of part of the adventure too. So I find that helps. Otherwise, I'm just happy to just kind of like improvise and then make notes after. Maybe that's what it is. Is I don't prepare too much before, but I do make really detailed notes after, and I really keep those notes and kind of like organize those so that way before we start playing, I can like reread and kind of like remember what they've interacted with. So that way, maybe they don't remember a character or I don't know, a guard that they've interacted with, but then shows up again during his downtime or something like that. Then the players are like, "Oh yeah, okay, like cool. This is like this world feels alive." But I maybe didn't have that planned until reading 10 minutes before we start. So I can't say that I have any good advice on how to wing it outside of like
I
do
think
a.
that was pretty good
Oh,
advice
good.
for how to wing it. If I'm going to be honest, that was some pretty solid advice for spinning a flailing, not knowing how to answer into something that can be intriguing and a plot hook for later.
Yeah. Yeah, it really is okay to not have all the answers. I think that's both in life and in D&D. I think it's okay if the NPCs don't know everything. Or even just kind of that 30 or 10 seconds of like, oh, I don't know, let me go get like, I just work here, I'll go get the manager, and then in that time then they're talking, and then you can think about what you're going to do, and when they come back and the manager then sits down and they say these are the rules, then it feels like it wasn't just made up on the spot. It's like, oh, this person didn't have this information but this person did. So the big thing is I don't want to deter my players from like asking questions. I want them to know that they need to be smart about who they ask, because if you just ask any random dude what is the history of this world, I mean, I think you could say that to anyone in the real world and they probably wouldn't be able to give you too much, or maybe scraps, but like bits and pieces, not the kind of like a picture.
Mhm. Yeah, I think
So
it gives. I think as far as plot hooks go, that gives people a lot more to delve into and to investigate. And I think it feels very natural in a lot of settings. I think I can picture like an Emerald City bureaucrat absolutely saying that they need to go get like a form because they don't know what it is,
yeah.
something like that. It's interesting that you mentioned a situation like using a guard that comes back and recurs, and someone that maybe might not have been a critical player as an NPC suddenly is very interesting plot wise and is part of the story. And on a bigger scale, in Oz, we have these kind of very legendary, very larger-than-life characters that are so incorporated into Baum's canon and kind of into popular culture as a whole now at this point, with Wizard of Oz having come out when it did. So you have the Cowardly Lion, you have Dorothy, you have the Tin Man, you have, going beyond just the original itself into the other novels, there's the Wheelies, there's everything else that we end up encountering. And they've been really interestingly transformed in Oz. I'm sitting here looking through it. And each one of them, I think there's something that I like about the book, really speaks to the archetypes of the characters and the way that these characters are kind of cemented in our cultural memory or the way that we've encountered them. But they're really, really unique to the book itself. And I wondered if you could tell us a little bit about approaching those characters and figuring out how they were going to fit into this world in a way that players could encounter them without it being like, oh, now the game's over, you met Dorothy.
Yeah, I think the big thing with this world was because there were so many, like, unlike where Neverland has like a few really crucial characters like Hook and Peter Pan and Tinkerbell and those kind of spread out across the island. With Oz, it's like obviously like there are more books, so there's like more characters in that I wanted it to be flexible in the setup that if you have only ever played or have only ever like watched the original movie or even the both movies, then you can pick those key characters out and put them into kind of like political roles or like faction roles in a way that they become important without kind of getting bogged down by all the other characters. So in researching the books, because I like read a number of the books when I was younger, but I obviously need to read more in preparation for this. There's so many more characters that I didn't know about, but also I recognize that it's probably his favorite character. So like if you like Captain Bill or Button Bright, and maybe this means nothing to anyone listening, but like if you like those characters, then you're gonna want those to be present. But I don't want them to kind of like be pushed aside just because they're not as well known. So my approach to the characters was learn as I can about them, or like relearn what I can about them, and then just kind of like put them in limbo. So like the random tables or the kind of like just the general political structure doesn't assume that, Tin Man is running the West District. Like if you want an obscure character like Polychrome, and I would like not, well, yeah, a lesser known character like Polychrome to be the mayor, then that's who's the mayor. Like it's your Oz. You can kind of slot them in as you want. And if all you want is Tin Man or the Tin Woodman and Cowardly Lion, Scarecrow, and Dorothy, then that's it. And then the random tables allow for that because they are like, oh, you meet the West. So whoever the warden is, that's who you run into. So that was kind of my approach. It's general enough, hopefully, that folks who are only using the tables can still have good kind of like interactions, but I'm also assuming that there's going to be some scripted stuff that players or that DMs introduce into their adventures. So I don't know. My approach to the characters was learn as much as I can, and then try to distill that down into kind of like their core kind of like essence as I write their stat blocks and their kind of brief bios.
I have to share one story really quickly. Specifically that at Gen Con we had somebody step by the table so they could show us their Button Bright tattoo.
Oh, cool.
Because specifically they picked up a copy of the book, so that was awesome. About that one.
Yeah, that's great. And I didn't know much about Button Bright and Captain Bill start in other books and come into Oswald. I don't know. There's so much. I've learned so much about L. Frank Baum and kind of like these books from doing research for this beyond what I thought I knew. And it's very cool, kind of like interconnected world of his.
It's really, and I had no idea pre-reading this book either, the amount of work that L. Frank Baum put out and the amount of interconnection that exists between the novels.
Yeah, it's I love the Discworld series of novels, which are kind of like these. They're all interconnected, but they're repeating characters, but not necessarily following one single plot. And I really love reading this, and I'm still reading through the series. But in researching Oz, realized, oh, this is what he was doing. Like this is what Baum was doing, was kind of like making this world and characters kind of like interact with both Oz and like kind of like these outer lands beyond Oz. Like it really felt alive, and kind of like we were just kind of getting these kind of like slices of these characters' bigger or kind of like more complete lives. And I really appreciated that. Like I appreciated that approach to the work, and wanted to kind of again make this book feel like you could have that as well. Like kind of, oh, it's not, these characters aren't just like waiting for you to kind of come up into them. Like they have their own goals. They're often kind of dealing with their own problems or kind of highs and lows. So
they're not hovering, waiting for a
player. Yeah, exactly. So Yeah, it was really fun to kind of find that out and discover that, and then try to kind of like bring that into this new interpretation of it. So, I mean, maybe I got some of the way there, but we'll only kind of like the diehard fans will be able to really kind of let me know.
I'm excited. I really hope whoever had that tattoo ends up like DMing us or tagging us in something, because they grabbed a copy of the book and I really want to know what their thoughts are on it now.
Yeah, I want to know how they feel about my interpretation of Button Bright. So we'll see. I really tried to make him stand apart from Dorothy as like the two like children who are not from Oz that kind of come to Oz. So, I mean, we'll see. Only time will tell.
Yeah, yeah. I wonder, as you were going through L. Frank Baum's works, did you read like all the way through them? Did you start with like where did you start to begin with?
Yeah, I started back at the first book and then read through all of Baum's work. I didn't end up getting into oh, I forget her. It's Ruth, is it Ruth Plumley? I forgive me for not remembering her name, but like she took over for writing about Oz after L. Frank Baum. But I didn't get into her work as much. Just based on like copyright, and I like need to kind of give myself some sort of cutoff. So the first kind of like dozen or so books I figured was plenty. So some were rereading, most, especially kind of like after the first six, were kind of like first time encounters. And while I knew some of the characters, like Scraps, and that I knew about them, but didn't really kind of like read their stories. So that's where I got into like the Patchwork Girl of Oz and TikTok of Oz and Scarecrow of Oz, like all these kind of like other, again, like those slice of life stories. So yeah, that was my the material was read what I'd already read and really dive into the stuff that I hadn't yet kind of discovered.
It definitely shows as far as how immersive this world is and the detail that went into it. I'm looking through right now at the parade route section, which is I think one of my favorites of it, and it's just because it really, the descriptions that you've included and the way that you've set it up makes it very easy, I think, to put players there in a way that feels very, very natural. That feels like they're going to have to dodge around this parade route if they want to get anywhere, if they want to find these bits and pieces of information that are going to drive things forward.
Yeah, I'll start continue.
Something that I like about Baum's work, and I like about Oz in particular, is that there seems to be a little bit of an archetype over the whole thing of this idea of wonder and maintaining this sense of wonder and the sense of joy and this sense of kind of possibility that really kind of powers a lot of the magic and a lot of what this world is. And there's kind of a conflict there that arises between that notion of preserving, whether it's whimsy or imagination, and realism and starkness, and kind of, for lack of a better term, like the adult world, on the opposite side of that. And I wonder if you could speak a little bit to the way that you created conflict in Oz, or the way that viewing all of the political interactions from the books or all of the characters' individual struggles. What did you decide to bring to Oz into the campaign as far as conflict goes, as far as what the driving force behind adventure, or as far as where players are going to find themselves in a sense of what they need to do or a peril they need to face or what's going to push them toward adventure?
Well, I think, I mean, like, so in keeping with kind of like the themes of at least the original book, of kind of the appearances can be deceiving. Like this big, terrifying lion is actually kind of like really kind of like a cowardly, sensitive creature, and this big, strong man made of tin is also a sensitive creature. I wanted that to kind of like carry over into again like the big picture of Oz. So a lot of the conflict comes from, well, I mean, like, I guess it also depends on what the DM, like whoever is running this game, they're going to choose what is the major conflict, whether it is like secret cults or testing, or is it widespread invasion from these creatures that are attacking. It's like it's up to the DM whether or not they want it to be external or internal. But I would say one of my driving forces was kind of like that second level. Like I didn't want Oz to feel like walking down the streets was constantly dangerous. I wanted it to feel like it was kind of like a happy, healthy land, but that there are just kind of like these like little bits of rot that maybe the players can help to excise. Like I think that's where I want the conflict to come from, or at least in my mind, that's what I picture. Is that the first couple of sessions are just kind of like, oh, this is beautiful. This is like the streets are clean and there's all these like happy people and there's some weird creatures and all the animals talk. And all this just like seems like happy and fun. And then as you start to spend more time there, you discover, oh, like magic is restricted. So like, what does that mean? And why are there these rules? And what does that mean for us who maybe cast or use magic? And then what does that mean for people who aren't as kind of like, I don't know, like just become this kind of like layered kind of like, I don't know, revealing of the land. So I think the conflict comes from, oh, we thought things were really great, and now we're discovering that it's not all kind of like that. That kind of appearances can be deceiving. So I think that's my goal for the conflict is what looks great maybe isn't, and how do we maybe get it back to what we thought Oz was.
I like that. I like it not being necessarily as bleak as Return to Oz.
Yes, yeah.
Everything is completely crumbled and grimdark and nightmarish. I love the idea of you being almost similar to Dorothy, encountering this world that's everything you had ever wanted it to be.
Yeah,
it's gleaming and magical and beautiful, and you're like, oh, there's bureaucracy here. There's corruption. There's things are not always 100% great past the gleaming exterior.
Yeah, because especially in the early books too, a lot of political stuff like with Oscar Diggs, like the wizard, as he leaves in the first book. Then that leaves like a kind of a power. Oh no, I guess like the scarecrow gets elected, but then the next book, then there's kind of like a general who tries to like usurp him, and then there's like all this political play, and it's like all done very genially, but like it's also perfect for a campaign that like you could have a mayor or a warden from a district who decides that they actually want to like be in control of two or all four districts. So what does that happen? And like players engage with that, or they like let those kind of like politics that are much bigger than them happen around them. Like it's all in the, I mean, like I don't want to say it's all in the books, but like all the kind of inspiration or the stuff that I really want to keep came from a love of the source material.
I really love that. I wondered if you could talk a little bit more about the Magic Man as being one of the central hooks that we find in Oz. I think it is, one, a great plot hook for a lot of adventure because it immediately kind of creates an undercurrent of struggle. And then you have to go, as you said, figure out what the rules are, why this is happening. But I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about deciding to include that as one of the plot hooks. Do you think that mirrors kind of the larger plots in Oz about like reality versus magic, or about like childlike wonder versus like adult cynicism?
Yeah, it's and I mean, again, this also came from the books because at the end of the sixth book, then like Princess Ozma kind of like decrees that the like magic will be kind of like restricted, or kind of like that there's no more magic in the land. Like she like makes the bubble, and like I've played enough D&D games to be like, yeah, that makes sense. Like especially, and I put it in the book. Like there are people who are like literally summoning thunderstorms and like small nuclear explosions. And we're just kind of like okay with that. So like I think there's like an element of you can kind of understand where they're coming from, especially as this land is like developed and like it's like really kind of like densely populated. Like it's not like you're just kind of like shooting ice blasts out in the wilderness and it hits a tree and you move on. Like
No, there's
if you
pedestrians. Like...
yeah, exactly. So like if there's a creature and everyone's trying to restrain it, but then you just kind of like decide to like lift it up and throw it, then it's going to land probably into someone's like rooftop or something. So I don't know. The vision behind the Magic Band was to add an element of like, oh, we're all very comfortable, but also like I'm a level one wizard and I'm used to using prestidigitation. Like now I'm actually stressed about like using this very casual thing because I don't know or I don't have the proper license yet to use it. So that also kind of like just naturally becomes kind of like part of the adventure too. Like every game I've run, when they first realize it, that first time that they are in a fight and they are trying to decide magic or not, is like a really great tension. And then they are also like, oh, do I how do I get a license? And then that starts to become and introduce them into the political component of Oz, which is also a big kind of driving force of that is I want them to engage with the wardens or the district wizards and which so by having that magic ban and then having players who want to use magic, you immediately are setting them up for, oh, we need to interact with the politics of Oz so I don't just constantly get thrown in jail.
It's a pretty good motivator overall. I thought it was really interesting that you specifically used the example of there being like a rogue creature that people need to restrain and the reality of dealing with that, on like a street level setting. And it got my gears turning a little bit thinking about urban adventures and the differences in running like a hex crawl versus doing an urban crawl. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that between moving from Neverland into starting to write Oz and starting to realize the requirements of writing an urban adventure, or some things that you discovered, or maybe some things that were challenges, or some things that you maybe didn't expect about doing an urban setting versus doing like a traditional, high fantasy. We're out in the field shooting fireballs at each other.
Yeah, it was really, I mean, like one, it's much more granular. Like I think you can say, oh, we're in a forest, and I think there's lots of trees, and maybe people ask or a player will ask about maybe the trees or about the something about the kind of like nature. But in general, that kind of gives you a sense of the forest as you're walking through it. But when you're walking through a street, people are your players are gonna ask like, well, what are the shops and who's walking around? Like, just there's like more details that add or that are required to kind of like paint the picture. Um, so that was a big part of how I approached designing this, was giving enough detail that you could answer those questions pretty quickly, because that's what I also was like scared of and had most trouble with in running urban adventures, was like I don't want it to just be another bakery, candle shop, and tavern or inn, right? Like you want there to be some variety, especially if you're in different neighborhoods. So like there's a neighborhood that's like mostly restaurants. So like yeah, there's probably apartments on the second floor, but like you're probably not getting like groceries or finding like a metalsmith in this neighborhood. You have to go to this neighborhood. So that was part of how I kind of tried to approach it. But I also really realized that an urban adventure is really kind of driven by social interactions, or at least how I've approached Oz and how I approach an urban adventure. Because like the bars are often full, the streets are often busy, like there's just like people around, which makes that fight with a creature more stressful, but also means that you're going to bump into someone or someone's going to try to pickpocket you or things like that, right? So my approach to this was, how do I make it feel like these social encounters are like easy to run and natural? So that's where I also kind of like include neighborhood, like a list of guilds, the way you could figure out, oh, like what are the sort of like jobs that you would normally run into here? So again, not everyone is just selling candles or bread, right? Like you've got, oh, like I actually like clean silverware. And it's like, oh, weird. That's like weird. But I guess like in a restaurant neighborhood, if people are bringing their own personal cutlery, then yeah, I guess there would be like a silverware cleaner cart. So just like it just like adds a bit of flavor in a way that doesn't feel like these neighborhoods are the same.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that it'll give you more of an opportunity for creating those details or finding examples of those details to provide players than you did in maybe creating a much more traditional hex crawl?
Yeah, it really made me research like businesses in lots of different ways. Like I've learned about so many more different types of, or so many types of careers
Mm-hmm.
from writing this book. Because I mean, like Oz doesn't really kind of get into the like the day to day of kind of like sewage maintenance, right? Or like I guess I've really learned about what it takes to make a city. And while I don't see Oz as like a truly functional city, it feels like it is, or I've done my best to try to make it feel like that is, and that's something that I don't think I needed to do for Neverland, because it's like more lightly populated and there's a lot of wilderness. So like the food and the game and like there's enough to kind of like support that like small villages seem natural. But when you get into a mega city like this, it's like, oh well, like where's food coming from? Where is all this like the electricity? Is there electricity? And if there is, where's that coming from? Where's the beams for the train tracks coming from? Like kind of answering all these questions that people may not have right away, but as they explore, go, oh yeah, that's where all the bricks for the yellow brick road come from. Now we're in that neighborhood, interesting, and then that kind of like makes it again feel more alive because they may not be looking for it, but it's there.
I like that. I like it might not be looking for it, but it's there. That's, I think, a really fun way to talk about handling detail as a game runner. What were some challenges that you encountered as far as you mentioned learning a lot about how cities operate and a lot about how supply and demand informs that, as far as, where does electricity come from? How does water get here? Did you ever run into in designing the maps or in designing the city itself any problems as far as I'm going to describe this as best as I can. were you ever designing an environment and ran into a roadblock where you're like, oh well, from like a the water has to be redirected here? Do you get into the kind of problems that like actual city planners get into when you're coming up with like layouts?
Oh no! I want to stress that this is not a truly functional city. I mean, like I think if you pull at any thread, you'll really kind of like make it collapse pretty quickly. But I will say, on the surface, it looks like it could run. I think one of my biggest challenge, and I recognize that I couldn't really do that. Like, there's a neighborhood that's dedicated to kind of like the infrastructure of Oz, like pipe work and water treatment and stuff. But I don't get into the details of it because I don't know enough about that, and like I can only kind of dig into a topic for so long before I go, oh, I've like lost the plot here. So with that, I will say though, a lot of time was spent on the map as far as figuring the scale. Like I wanted this city to be big, but like each neighborhood on average roughly takes about an hour to walk through or explore, and that felt right. Like again, because there were so many neighborhoods, it was really it took time to like look at real cities and go, oh, how long does it take me to walk from like the top to the bottom of Manhattan, and how many neighborhoods are there, and what does that mean, and is that the right size? Because I mean, I'm not great at scale, especially when we get into big scales like that, of really kind of like comprehending it. So that took a lot of research. And maybe someone who is a city planner will look at this and go, "This scale is insane. Like this is impossible." But that's I wipe my hands clean of it. It's done, and you can just change it. And I understand. But yeah, figuring out the scale, and again, like how long does it take to walk, and then how long does it take the subway or the underground to get from neighborhood to neighborhood? That stuff took a while, but then once I committed to it and felt like this feels okay,
Did you
then
find
I
yourself
just released
like
it.
going for walks ever? Did you like take a subway?
I don't live near subways, but I did use my city as a frame of reference, and that really helped. Of like, oh yeah, this is how you can get into a neighborhood if I walk an hour in any direction. And again, that really helped me go like, yeah, this is enough to like get all of the tinsmiths into a neighborhood without it feeling like too big, or like it's a city in its own right. Like it feels like it feels like an hour is enough to have like, oh, there is still an inn in this neighborhood, but it's not going to be like the recreation neighborhood, if that makes sense. Like yeah, it's big enough but not too big that it should be its own tiny city within a city.
Something that I like about the book a lot, and I think that's something that's a challenge when it comes to to urban crawl design a lot, is a sense of scale. And I think the notion of even just having a neighborhood takes about an hour to walk around, it really, really definitively paints a picture, kind of in my mind, and I think players' minds when it comes to the environment they're in. When I when I got my copy of Oz, I remembered opening it and going through some of the maps, and I was like, okay, I'm in Magic Brooklyn.
Yeah.
This is how I'm going to think of it in terms of scale. I can get from here to here, and if I take the L, then I can go get my wizard license.
Yep, absolutely.
And I really like that. I think it introduces a dimension of realism that I didn't expect in even an urban crawl, and I appreciated that about it a lot. The maps in particular give you really the idea of what it's like being a citizen day to day.
Oh, great.
Yeah, and it's I was looking at running it a little while ago to demo it to a group of people, and I was like, okay, well, we're going to make an entire little side quest here where you're going to have to start at one end of the city and you have to go get a set of glasses at like an optometrist's across
Yeah.
the city. And like I was like, okay, well, I'm going to have to write some. Oh wait, no, never mind. I don't actually have to do that. It's already there. I don't have to make up anything to get people from point A to point B.
Yeah.
And I think just the ability the way you set it up gives people to really, really say anywhere within this environment where I want them to get from point A to point B. You can get them there map wise, but there's also plot hooks along the way, and there's people that they can encounter along the way, and it's laid out in such a way that it makes that something I really appreciate about the book.
Oh, great. I was running well, it's the second part of a one shot, but they were trying to decide how do we get from this neighborhood to this neighborhood. We could take the underground, but there's a couple of stops, or we could take the overground, but then it was more expensive, and they're like, oh, we don't have that much money. Like, and that's kind of like what happens in real life. Like, oh, I guess we could take a taxi, but like it's also cheaper to take the subway, but it's slower and it might break down. And like again, it just like feels. And I mean, admittedly, I've done a lot of this through those random tables, but like at the end of the day, I still want it to feel like you're making decisions not based off of like game mechanics, but off of like what would our players do if we were in this fantasy city, and that's kind of my goal. So yeah, if your players are trying to get across the city and they're trying to figure out do we take the quick way or the cheap way, that's ideal. That's all I want out of Oz.
I think you definitely managed to get it there. I think a lot of
Thank you.
I think something that is I think a hard balance to strike too is with urban fantasy a lot. There's this notion of, and I struggle with it because I'm like, I absolutely want to live like in a city where magic is mundane, where low magic is common. Like I want to see an orc when I go to the laundromat, but it's so easy for it to feel so far one way or the other, where it's either a little bit too close to real life, and I start thinking about the fact that I have to pay my taxes, or it's so far to the opposite side of the spectrum where you lose the realism. And I think that there's a real balance struck in Oz where you feel very immersed in this world, but there's also those moments of, oh yeah, no, we can take the subway, it's faster, but it's cheaper. That I appreciate a lot. And I wonder if you could spend just a moment talking about striking that balance a little bit, or finding what was the line between having practical moments like that, moments that are very grounded in the reality of living in a city environment, but also having it distinctly Oz and having kind of the magic of that there without one drowning out the other, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think I really tried to pull, because I also picking like a time period was hard. Like again, for that balance, right? Like if we get too far into the Industrial Revolution, then I think magic kind of really becomes obsolete. Like I wanted it to feel like, oh, like we've got a number of subways, but there's still kind of like there's only a handful of stops and they only get so far, and there are still people who maybe are using magic illegally, and maybe they're using magic to dig these tunnels for the subways, but everything is still very new. And that's where kind of like really the turn of the century was what I kind of had landed on, because one, based on like kind of when the original Oz books were written, I think that was part of it too. Like I think the sort of fantastical stuff that Baum had put into his books was kind of in keeping with kind of the real life fantastical stuff that was happening as far as production and kind of like automation and so on.
Hot
So
yeah.
yeah, exactly. Right. Yeah. So I mean, like, there's something kind of like charming that a hot air balloon is like really exciting. And I wanted that to be the era of kind of technology for Oz. Because I think if you get too far into like a steampunk kind of like aesthetic, which there's hints of that here, but I think if you get too far into that technology, then the magic really becomes obsolete. So I think if the technology is new, but maybe not as good as magic, then there's a balance between the magic is better, but it's also kind of like you said, mundane, or we're like accustomed to it, and now we're not allowed to use it. So we might as well use this like thing that's not quite as good, but it's new and different. Like it's novel that we have an elevator, but even though people could probably use a spell to make themselves fly, like it's simpler or like less taxing, or you can fit more people into it. So it's like not as exciting to maybe us, but to the people in Oz, it's like, oh yeah, this is like easy. So again, I don't know. I think everyone running Oz will maybe lean into one or the other a bit more, and hopefully I found a balance that you can really still make it like, oh, Oz has just started banning magic and people are not used to it yet, or people are so focused on the technology that people forget about magic, and then your players come in and they're casting spells and like, oh right, yeah, I forgot, like I knew someone to be able to do that spell, and I don't know what to them, and then that becomes a plot thread. So yeah, anyway, that's my approach to technology versus magic, is I think if both are still kind of novel, then they balance each other out in their own way.
I think that's really cool. I think the era in particular, kind of that turn of the century era, really speaks to that kind of struggle between what was an older and kind of more wondrous way of kind of new notions of automation and industrialization moving in. I see a little bit of that in the introduction of the book that strikes me really immediately visually, and it's really how kind of Art Nouveau of kind of the introductions are, and some of the chapter headers are. Did you like spend time immersing yourself in like art and design from the era to get inspired for this? I'm a huge Art Nouveau fan, so I'm like really biased this way. I think that a lot of like the form and a lot of the design from that era is really, really interesting. So I'd love to hear how it may have inspired you, or how it became incorporated in the overall visual style of Oz is now.
Oh no, I'm really happy that you picked up on that, because admittedly it's not an aesthetic that I illustrate much. Like with Neverland, I really kind of like went for mid-century kind of children's book illustrations. So that I'm like is my wheelhouse and I felt comfortable with. But with Oz, I wanted to push myself to also illustrate in a way that complemented that world. So yes, to your question, absolutely, Art Nouveau was a huge influence, partially because of the time period, but also because of, again, I think that movement really kind of celebrated industry, or like kind of like automation, and kind of the kind of like great power over the elements that the mundane kind of like manufacturers had, which I thought was kind of appropriate for Oz. And I hear myself and I sound so pretentious. I guess what I just mean is like I love the aesthetic, and I like really suited I really kind of like could picture the Tin Man in a like Metropolis like film, and or like a big loom statue that is kind of like, that Tim Burton Gotham City type thing. It just like felt right for wonder, but also still new. If that makes sense, like the glasses, all of it, the statues. Yeah, I tried to put hints in there as much as I could.
Yeah, I definitely love that. I think that's fantastic. I love the idea of like some of the older New York train stations that are very deco and like very Art Nouveau,
Yeah,
ironwork, and in like the murals, that hundreds of people are moving past every single day. That's kind of this very fantastical, like very aspiration to older works and like European folklore. That's so just ingrained in something so mechanized and so industrial, and it's really is kind of straddling those two eras. So I really love that in particular about the book. And I think that visually it reaffirms a lot about what you're saying about the era that Oz inhabits and what you were looking for in striking a balance between kind of the urban and the magical.
thank you. I really wanted to feel like a city edge of kind of like this new breakthrough. Like, yes, we have trains and yes, elevators, and we're doing all this kind of new stuff, but it still is just starting. Like, I mean, I'm sure lots of people write the subway every day and not take it for granted, but like don't see the magic in it, which I understand. But I wanted this to be a slice of time or a moment in time, can like see that technology and really can like see the beauty in it. And that's, I think, where the kind of like Art Nouveau moment or movement or Art Deco really kind of like shines.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that we get a really great lens into that notion in Oz, and I think it's a very emerald tinted lens. And it works.
Yeah,
It works
absolutely.
really, really well. We are just about at time here. I have a couple questions that came in from Instagram that I wondered if I
Okay.
could offer as just a quick lightning round before we wrap up.
Yeah, hit me.
All right. Okay. First one, Andrew. I had the chance at Gen Con to pick up a copy of Oz, and I think the thing that struck me immediately was the first page I opened to had a hippo giraffe on it. I didn't think that you would include something like that. What are some more of the more obscure monsters or creatures that I can look out for in this book?
Oh man, I mean, there's so many from I'll just like flip to a random page. I don't. I mean, again, this is now tricky because I don't know how obscure these things are because to me they're all kind of like equal. But I really liked Baum's interpretation of gargoyles. Like they're wooden. Their mouths don't open and their wings are like hinged, like a door hinge. So I really liked that, which again feels familiar but is also kind of obscure. I really liked the hammerheads. I mean, no, we aren't that obscure. I mean, we've got loons, which are like balloon people. We've got fuddles, which are like puzzle people. There's all these kind of like different like races or like, kind of like ancestries of creatures that I really like to enjoy include. So you've got the bunnies, you've got the dough people, you've got utensians, which are like sentient kitchen utensils. Yeah, I mean, everything that I could fit in, I did. Obscure as possible.
I think people are going to have plenty to find that they didn't think
Fair,
there
thank you.
initially. We've got one more question from Instagram, and it says, I noticed that there's a table in the book that includes a version of what appears to be American Sign Language for some of the creatures to communicate. How did you go about designing that?
Oh, I am. I don't have much experience with ASL outside of just kind of like a semi appreciation for it. But I'm actually speaking to the gargoyles because their mouths don't move. Then I assume that they would communicate with each other with like a form of like hand gesture. So that's where kind of like that kind of like intent of sign language came in. So the reason I include that is so that one, if you're running an encounter with the gargoyles and they're trying to communicate something to your players, that do a proper like sign, and then anyone who maybe already knows ASL can like connect, or then that can be something that they research later. Like if you give them a handout with that gesture on it or like with that sign on it, then they can find that in a library and maybe discover that Aussie Sign Language is the same as ASL, and therefore discover that, oh, those creatures were talking about friend or food, and then kind of go from there. So my intent was to make something that added another layer of communication and accessibility within the book.
That's excellent. It's something that I thought was really cool too. Through it, and I was like, if I'm ever running this, I'm going to need to learn like at least a little bit of it because I want to be able to do it at the table. So if
Oh, I
I can
mean,
pick up on it, I think it would be really fun.
yeah, very cool. I mean, like again, this is as someone who's like not ingrained in it. Like there's a game out that really kind of like teaches sign language through tabletop role playing. That's listed in the back of the book. So
Oh,
this
very
is just
cool.
kind of like a skimming the surface where they really kind of like dive and dig in deep. So hopefully that they will. If you like this, then can like build off of that because I think there's like magic involved with it too. It's very cool. But yeah, that was the approach to the Aussie sign language.
Excellent. I'm excited for people to dive into it a little bit more. That's the questions that we had.
Cool.
That's also about time where we're at. Thank you so much for joining us today and for answering all of my probing questions in such an insightful way. I really appreciate it.
No, my pleasure. I appreciate this, and I
Yeah,
appreciate your questions
absolutely.
too.
Before we wrap up, I would love it if you could just summarize Oz for us. Maybe in what you think is the most important thing that you'd like people to know about it, or really how you give it to people as either an elevator pitch or to get them excited about it.
Oh yeah, okay. So as I understand, the three pillars of Dungeons and Dragons are like social combat and exploration. So my kind of like driving thesis of Neverland was exploration, and now with this, my driving goal is social. Like if you're looking for kind of like an engaged like social urban setting, and that is what Oz has to offer. It does still have combat, it does still have exploration, but the kind of like the top of the triangle of those three pillars or those three kind of points of Oz is social. It's a social game through and through.
That's excellent. Thank you so much.
Thanks. Yeah, this has been great.
Yeah, and thanks again for joining us. This has been Andrew Kolb. Oz, a 5e compatible D&D adventure, is now available wherever TTRPG books are sold. Andrew, thank you again so much for joining us, and we're looking forward to seeing everybody listen to next week.
Yeah, thanks again.
Bye-bye.